Canada prides itself as being a place of equality, inclusion, opportunity, and justice. However, even Canada has made major mistakes that have impacted not only its future, but more specifically the lives of First Nations for generations to come. Starting in the 1890s, Indigenous children of all ages were removed from their homes, families, and placed in government run residential schools and churches throughout Canada. Children are separated based on their gender and placed into different Christian denominations and quickly forced to adapt to the white Anglo-centric culture. Often residential schools were overcrowded, had poor living conditions, and prohibited these children from keeping any of their cultural heritage. According to some of the estimates, over 100,000 children were into residential schools, and of that, 75% of children were abused. Due to the poor conditions, children would often attempt to run away, and though it's hard to estimate, research have guessed that up to 6,000 students may have died at these schools. Since 1996, when the last residential school was closed, Canada has made 2 public apologies to all the First Nation individuals as part of their attempts at reconciliation. However, in this instance, justice was denied because Canada's apologies does not address the present repercussions of the stolen generations, and their commitments are too vague and did not provide a timeline as to when these actions would be put in place. As well-intentioned as the public apologies might have been, they do nothing to address the poverty, substance abuse, employment, and education, which are a direct result of these historical injustices. Although Canada has stated they would increase funding, better children's education, and ensure they have better suicide prevention, First Nations communities are still having increasing rates in suicide, increasing rates in incarceration, and living in houses that are falling apart. For example, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, 62 and 64% of First Nations children are living below the poverty line, compared with 15 and 16% among non-Indigenous children in the provinces. Similarly, in my opinion, an apology is not enough to help these people fully recover for the century they have suffered in residential schools and stripped of their identity. Canada and Australia will both need to increase funding for these communities, ensure their house and reserves provide what is needed for individuals to live in a safe community, and provide rehabilitation for the individuals who would like to take advantage of the opportunity. I also believe that Canada and Australia should implement an education system for Indigenous people that is helpful and traditional to their beliefs and values. This way, we are not pushing any change on their community, embracing their traditions as well as language. By implementing an education system, this may help decrease incarceration rates and employment rates, because this will open up many employment opportunities for Indigenous teens and adults for further generations. Some people might say that we already spend too much money on First Nations people. For instance, in 2012, according to Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada, the department spends an average of $9,560 per registered First Nations person. By contrast, the federal government spends an average of $7,316 per Canadian. Some might say this is unfair. However, First Nations communities are extremely run down and require much more maintenance, infrastructure, and updating. Not to mention the fact that due to severe poverty, First Nations communities require more emergency health care, which costs more. In regard to employment, Indigenous people lack education, which decreases their likelihood of securing stable employment, which in turn means they require more social assistance to make ends meet. In conclusion, I do not think that justice has been served to the stolen generation, because an apology does not address the present repercussions and systemic injustice, and Canada's government did not provide specifics as to how exactly they will help First Nations communities. Canada needs to increase funding, provide a culturally appropriate education for children, and ensure their living conditions are safe, and then perhaps justice may be served.